Look at chapter 6. Because this is what the Scriptures say. Because the last 4 signs show the result of salvation in the believer. And when you and I came to Christ by faith, chapter 6, Jesus does another sign miracle, the feeding of the 5,000. Verse 4, the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near. And verse 5, Philip says, where are we going to get, he was always one of those detail guys, and where are we going to get enough food to feed these people? And Jesus said, oh, don't worry. There's a lad here, verse 9, who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. And Jesus said, make the people sit down. He's going to do something. And Jesus took the loaves, verse 11. When he gave thanks, he distributed them. And when they were filled, verse 12. Now there is a detail. Have you ever been to one of these highbrow receptions, where, like a business thing, and they have these little tiny things that, you get 3 or 4 of them, you eat them, and you don't even know you ate anything, and you're always unsatisfied, and you want more. You're so hungry. You ever been to one of those? That's what I think about. Most of what religion offers the world is little hors d'oeuvres. And people say, oh, man, that's great, but they go away hungry. But look what Jesus does when he feeds the 5,000, verse 12. So when they were filled. Remember, each of these signs had a following discourse. The bread of life is the discourse for this, which Jesus, starting in verse 22, goes all the way through the fact that he is the bread of God come down from heaven. But what is the lesson he's given to the people? When you get saved, salvation satisfies you. Look what it says in verse 12. They were filled. In fact, to prove they were filled, they picked up all those basketfuls of fragments. The people had more than they needed to eat. Remember, Jesus Christ came and he says, when I come to your life, you will have life and life abundant, overflowing. What did he say in John 7? He says, you'll be like having a river of water flowing out of you, overflowing in your life. What does salvation bring? Salvation brings satisfaction. Our life is satisfied. What does the song go? All my life long I was searching and never found what I was searching for. And Jesus satisfies my soul, as the songwriter put it. Jesus, the bread of life, satisfies us. Well, look at verse 16, because here's another sign. Jesus did another miraculous sign when he stilled the storm. When Jesus perceived they were about to come and take him and make him king, in verse 15, the evening came, and his disciples went down to the sea. In verse 17, they got in a boat, and they went toward Capernaum. In verse 18, the sea rose because of a great wind, and when they rowed 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, and they were afraid. And he said, it is I, don't be afraid. And they willingly received him, and immediately the storm was over, and they were on the shore. Now, isn't that a picture of what happens when we get saved? The instant we're saved, the storm of our life ceases. You see the difference? Salvation, what's the effect in our lives? It satisfies us, and it brings us peace. Here's the next one in chapter 9. His 6th of 7 signs is in chapter 9, John's Gospel. So Jesus turns water into wine, heals the nobleman's son, heals the paralytic, feeds the 5,000, stills the storm. Now he's going to heal the blind man in chapter 9. And by the way, remember I said every one of these miracles produces a sermon afterward, a lesson. Well, this blind man, and we'll go through his story real quick. They says, hey, verse 1 and 2, who sinned, this guy or his parents? And Jesus said, none of them, but so the works of God could be revealed, verse 3. And so Jesus, verse 6, when he had said these things, he spat on the ground, made clay with the saliva. Now, what are those details in there for? I mean, why did it have to tell us that? Very interesting if you study it. He anointed the eyes of the blind man with clay, and he said in verse 7, go wash in the pool of Siloam. There are lots of pools around Jerusalem. Why do you have to go to that one? See, many details. By the way, he was healed and he was made to see, but look at verse 14. It was on the Sabbath. And so the Pharisees got upset in verse 15, and by the time you get to the end of this chapter, they had thrown this guy out. The one that had been healed, threw him out of the synagogue, said, you're not welcome anymore. So what was Jesus' sermon in chapter 10? Everybody who comes to me will never get what? Thrown out. You see how everything fit together? And through this sign, He showed them that if you come to me, your eyes will be open. Remember, salvation is opened eyes turned from darkness to light. And if you come to the light, Jesus Christ, with sight spiritually, all who come to me will never be cast out, the Lord said. And so that's his lesson. Well, here's the last one. Look at chapter 11. And by the way, they're so hard to go over them fast, but we have to get through them. Look at verse 38 of chapter 11. This is the seventh sign. Jesus turns the water into wine in chapter 2, heals an old son in chapter 4, heals the paralytic in 5, feeds the 5,000, stills the storm, heals the blind man. But now, in verse 38 to 45, he raises Lazarus. And so, it says in 38, Jesus groaned. 39, take away the stone. And then he says very clearly at the end of verse 43, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And verse 44 says, he who had died came out bound hand and foot with grave clothes. His face was wrapped with a cloth, and Jesus said, loose him and let him go. You know what? Jesus raised him from the dead, but you know what it was a picture of? It's a picture of salvation. Salvation gives life. We who are dead in our trespasses and sin come alive. And so what does he do? He teaches them that salvation in the believer brings life and light and peace and satisfaction. Those are his 4 last signs. And salvation comes to the sinner miraculously by faith and through God's grace. Now, turn back to chapter 2, because I just want to show you what a blessing these are. But in chapter 2, let me read the first 11 verses real fast and have you underline some details in your minds. Okay, let me ask you, because, by the way, I went to Sunday school my whole life, too. You know, I heard those testimonies in FOF. I heard one of them say he always went to church. So did I. Went to church before I was born, you know. Whole life in church. And I heard all those stories. And I've heard my wonderful Sunday school teachers tell me the story of the water into wine so many times, I could retell it by the time I got out of Sunday school, right? But what they always said is, Jesus went to this wedding, and Jesus turned the water into wine. But you shouldn't drink wine. Alcohol's bad. And then we went on to the next one. That was the only lesson I got out of it, right? Don't drink. Do you think that's the lesson of this? That's clearly in other places. It's sure not in here because they drank it. It didn't work, you know, with me. They all drank the wine Jesus made, and we're not supposed to. How come, you know? They should go to the parts where it says don't drink, which are very clear. But what is the lesson of the water into wine stuff? And also, when the Apostle John was writing this almost 70 years after it happened, he's looking back, and the Spirit of God is guiding him. And he, under the Spirit's guidance, puts in details that it seemed like he couldn't forget because they were so vivid to him. What were the details? Number 1, in verse 1, it was on the 3rd day. 3rd day? What's this 3rd day stuff? Why, there's a succession, a series of events. And this is just the 3rd day, and it started in chapter 1. It's going to continue. Second detail, it was a wedding. Why didn't you just say you went to a party? Why do you have to go to a wedding? Is there something significant about the wedding? Verse 3, they ran out of wine. That's a detail. I mean, it was important at weddings. It was an honor to provide your guests wine, which the Old Testament Jewish mind, wine is always a picture of joy and gladness. Not a picture of drunkenness and despair because they diluted their wine. And only those who drank it straight, they were called pagans and heathen. And so this was a sign of joy and gladness. Then look at verse 6. There were set there 6 water pots. Not 5, not 7, not 4. 6 water pots. But they aren't just water pots. They're water pots of stone. And they're for purification. That's interesting. I mean, why didn't he just say there were some pots over there? No. 6. They were water pots of stone for purification. And he even tells how much they hold. 20 or 30 gallons. Now, all these details, as we'll see next time, are vital. Look at this at verse 7. And they filled them to the brim. That's interesting. Verse 10 at the end, the professional MC that did all the parties, who always got to taste everybody's wine because he was the ruler of the feast and that was his job. He said, you kept the best until now. Well, that's an important point. Verse 11. This is the beginning of signs. And look at the end of verse 11. His disciples, because of this, believed on him.